Sir.
Good morning. We're bringing this meeting to order. Welcome to the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. Today is September 21st. We've got 2019 on our agenda, but it is 2020. Those of you who wish you can go back that far in time. Excellent. Let's go ahead and make introductions. We'll start with Mr. Johnson. Please introduce yourself. We'll just go around.
Doug Johnson, Assembly.
Karen Braga, Assembly.
Scott Myers, Assembly.
Christopher Thompson.
George Martinez.
And Kevin Cross. All right, excellent. We're just looking at our agenda here. I just want to remind you that since we're the audible in this, the audio recording in this room is kind of poor, to speak up, make yourself clear. Because we don't have the privilege of video, please introduce yourself before you start speaking, so maybe on record we know that we can recognize you. We do have another assembly meeting at 11 o'clock, but it looks like based on our agenda, we should be able to get through this pretty expeditiously. Just so that the assembly members can leave here with adequate time to make it over to assembly chambers for 11 o'clock, the utility oversight meeting. So let's just start with unfinished business. Expand tax abatement for reinvestment focus areas. Discussion continued regarding mid-month reports, FRA tax incentives. Chris, run. Here comes Mike, just in time. Mr.
Just in
Robbins
time.
and Chris Shooting.
Oh, thank you.
I'm not going to actually lead this one. This is Mike's group.
Oh, is it? There you go.
Should I come to the
Good
table? Or?
morning,
Come on
Mike.
up.
Yes.
Yes, get closer.
That way that you're closer to the audio. We loved and appreciated.
I think there was a song about that.
Probably by Air Supply. Anything to do with love.
Oh, I already got that.
Send it around us.
Oh, sitting around, a good idea. Guess we should give everybody else a copy.
Oh, great.
Hey.
Well, thank you everybody for, while she's getting the presentation ready, I'll just preface the talk. By the way, how much time do you want me to fill today?
You got a light schedule, but if you keep it brief, we would appreciate it all the same.
I will. It's tough for me, but I'll try. So we have been, the last 5 months or so, ACDA retained McKinley Research to do a study of the real estate market, and it's especially focused on incentives. And today I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give you sort of a preview of some of the things from that market study, which we plan on releasing at the housing symposium that you guys are hosting in November. It's going to PIP to be printed and bound this week, so we'll give out nice copies to everybody who comes to that event. And then we're going to talk a little bit about current and existing incentives, as well as give everybody sort of an idea of where they can find that information easily. So I will delay no more, and we'll start off with the first slide. If you want to go to slide 2 for me.
Thank you, and I'll note that we've been joined by Anna Brarley at 9:05.
Good morning, Anna.
So I thought it was important, before we started to talk about incentives, that we just remind ourselves, why is housing important and why does it matter? Now, this was from a survey the AEDC did that talked about 47% of employers feel that the housing market is affecting their ability to attract workers. 15% had candidates who said, I'm not going to take your job in Anchorage because of the housing situation. And only 8% of their employees rated the housing situation or housing options as satisfactory. 44% said that they were dissatisfied. And why that's important is because that survey was done in 2019. And what you'll see when you look at the study that it's only gotten more challenging. There are some bright spots, but the housing situation in Anchorage has only gotten more challenging as it has around the rest of the country. This is pre-pandemic, and so it's only continued to deteriorate. Next slide, please. So this just kind of demonstrates the housing spectrum, which is something that I think is important for us to keep in mind. Because on the left side of the scale, you have temporary housing, which is your emergency shelters, transitional housing, and then on the far right side of the scale, we have market rate housing, which is the things that are at the top of the market. And then it talks about sort of where the money comes from. And the goal of our study and the goal that ACDA is promoting is a sustainable model to create attainable housing in Anchorage. Next slide.
Just for the record, Member Rivera and Member Volan are on the phone. Thank you.
What is attainable housing? That's a term that there's a lot of terms when you talk about housing. What is it? What would you know? It's not affordable, and a lot of people will mix up the two, attainable and affordable. Affordable housing is targeted at low-income individuals, people that are usually earning 30% or less of the average of the AMI for your particular market. Attainable housing, according to HUD, is housing options that are affordable and accessible to middle-income individuals and families and people who earn between 80% and 120% of the AMI for a particular area. So it's adjusted depending on where you are. If you look at Anchorage, that would mean that at the bottom of the spectrum for attainable housing is $79,000 a year. At the top is $119,000 a year. And the average price of a house in 2022 to buy was $456,000. So it sounds like a big number because it is. I remember I bought my first house in Anchorage back in the early 80s at Stonegate Condos, and I paid $51,000 for a 1,300 square foot condominium there. Next slide, please. And to put that number in perspective, if you look at, so we looked at, if you take the information from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and you apply, of course, when you go to buy a house, you know that every bank and finance company has their different ways that they calculate what you can afford. But if you look at what the government says, and we adjusted that down a little because when they look at that number, they don't include utilities, they don't include reality, I think, the utilities, taxes, things like that. So in order to be able for somebody that's at 80% of the area-wide median income at that $79,000, we need to produce, or they need to be able to find a house for $264,000. Now, I don't know about anybody who watches the real estate market in Anchorage, but there's not a lot of houses for sale at $264,000. And if you go even to the 120% of the area median income, it's $397,000, which again is almost $80,000 less than the average house sold for in Anchorage last year. Next slide. So what's affecting attainable housing development? Oh,
I
sorry.
have a question.
Yeah, just briefly, I wondered,
Do you want to go back?
yeah, because it was on that prior slide. I just want to note, so the other piece that isn't on there is the, what you would need for a 20% down payment. And I wonder if that's ever talked about.
5% is what we used. 5% down payment, because you don't generally, usually you can get into a house at 5%. You don't always need a 20% down payment. Most of the time I bought it at 5%. So.
Or zero.
Or zero down, yeah,
Yeah.
VA financing.
Right, well, I guess that's one population, but my point is just if you're looking at traditional financing, then
Right.
you also have to talk about, you know, up to $80,000, so I just want to add
You
that
do.
to the conversation.
That's a very good point. And we also, we took a snapshot when we did this. If you look at we figured 6.9% interest rate based on what's currently happening. Next slide. So attainable housing development, there's been a real dichotomy going on in our marketplace. Over the last several years, from 2015 to 2022, we've lost about 10,000 people in Anchorage. Normally, when you lose 10,000 residents, you would assume they're homeowners because they're moving, right? And normally that would soften your housing market. Our market's gotten worse. It's gotten tighter. It's gotten more expensive. In fact, I didn't include this graph, but one of the charts you'll find in the study is it talks about how our prices were increasing by 3 to 5%, you know, pretty regularly, 3%, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and values drop, and then all of a sudden the pandemic is over. And the last 3 years, housing values in Anchorage have gone up an average of over $80,000, which is pretty substantial when you think about that. So these two figures just talk about population growth or projections, and also about the new housing supply in Anchorage. So if you look at that blue bar across on the right graph, that shows you how many houses we built last year, 180 houses. If you look at the 2040 plan, it called for 21,000 housing units to be built by 2040. We are never going to hit that number. We're never going to hit that number unless we have a plan as to how we're going to do it. Next slide, please. So what you'll find inside the study when you get it is we did an analysis of the Anchorage housing market, population, considerations, all of the things you would expect when you look at a market snapshot. We also looked at the obstacles to attainable housing development, financial, from a financial perspective, a zoning perspective, and a procedural perspective. And then we looked at incentives for housing attainability in Anchorage in all of those categories as well, so that you could draw correlation between between the work. And then also you'll find some suggestions on sustainable and attainability. Next slide. One of the things we did, which is a little step further, we took a deeper dive, and instead of just looking at some anecdotal information and doing interviews with people.
Member Volan has a question on the phone.
I'm sorry.
Member Volan?
I wanted to drive home one of Mike's points. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to drive home one of Mike's points from that prior slide. Mike, did you say 100 housing units were built last year? 100?
180.
How many?
180. 180 single-family
180. Okay, so that's a dip from what we heard in Nolan Cloud's presentation at the housing retreat, which said that a couple years ago, Anchorage had built about 400 units a year. And to Mike's point about what the 2040 land use plan calls for, in order to reach that 20-something thousand that Mike mentioned, we should be building about 840 units a year. So that is far short. Not even half, a quarter of what we need. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Mike. And so far, I think it's a great report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, Member Boland. And you'll notice when you look at the entirety of the graph, the 402, which is, I think, the number that I've heard Nolan talk about in several presentations, we actually did build 402 doors, but we only built 180 single-family homes. And while the study does look at rent, does look at doors, just for the purpose of today's presentation, and we were talking about incentives was the focus, so I didn't talk much about rental housing, but we did look at the average price of rental and the increases, and you'll find all that information inside the study when you look at that. Next slide. Go ahead and go to the next one. So we went a little bit deeper, and instead of just looking at the anecdotal information, interviewing local people, we identified cities around the country in the West that are similar to Anchorage and that have had similar challenges with housing and growth and those things. They're all pretty much the same size as Anchorage, and we did a deep dive on those cities, contacting and talking to the individuals in the cities, finding out what programs they implemented, and you'll see most of the study is dedicated, or a large portion of it is dedicated to these 4 case studies, so that you can dig into them and you can look and see what they've done and how it's worked. If you'll go to the next slide. This is just some of the micro things that they've done inside of those areas we talked about, which is financial, process, zoning, and sustainability. And when you look at some of the things that they worked on, some of the incentives that they were using, and each one of these incentive areas and these incentives are explained in greater detail in the study. Next. And results matter, and I think that's this is the startness of the report. These are only attainable housing. This does not represent low end or high end of the spectrum. It's attainable housing units. And when you look at Boise, they built since 2018, they brought online 1,500 attainable housing units, not high end, not low end, but attainable. Because again, the idea was to focus on that. You look at Bellingham, Washington, Bend, Oregon, and Missoula, Montana. So, and then you can see some of the process improvements. This is a graph that, again, you'll find this inside, and you'll find this explained in great detail. But I wanted to show you, I was quite encouraged when we got this information, because I said, well, if Boise, Idaho can figure out how to solve this problem, Anchorage, Alaska can figure out how to deal with it. It's just a simple matter, I think, of having a plan and then working that plan and having the assembly and the planning department and the financing people in the city, everybody sort of coming together with administration and coming together and putting our shoulder into it and making a difference.
One of the things, though, Mike, is all of those places have land.
That's correct.
None of them have weather issues that we have.
Well, they have relative weather issues.
I mean, I'm
Relative,
from
yeah.
Bend, so I know that market well.
Right.
We have a land issue, though, a developable land issue.
We do, and that's addressed in the report. One of the things you'll find when you look at the report, it talks a lot about the land and the fact that we're landlocked. But there are things we can do. You know, one of the things that I think is a good idea when we approach problems is we should try to address the things that we can affect and not focus on those things that we can't. You're right. We only have so much land in Anchorage, but we do have access to land, and it's just a matter of us, how do we go and get that land? You know, the federal government owns a huge swath of land right in the middle of our city, and there have been other cities that have gone to the federal government, got special use permits to allow them to develop on that land, because they're literally choking us by not giving us access to that. So there are ways to accomplish that. We just have to put our shoulder into it.
We have a question, Mr. Constant, and then we'll go to.
Yeah, I just, on your point, I think that we have to focus on what we can do, and at the same time, we have to mitigate our expectations for what is
Possible.
possible and where the rubber meets the road to actually achieve, because we can't compare ourselves to people who have fundamentally different landscape and have the cheapest asset available is the land, and so for us it's the opposite. So anyhow, I think that just puts a very good point on being reasonable about what we expect out of all of this.
Without a doubt, but we have to be reasonable about what our resources are that are available to us. Without, I think that's a really good point. So,
Member Braun?
Yeah, just briefly, so I agree, we don't have a lot of land. However, our city has extremely inefficiently used our land over the last 30 years. So, I mean, so that's also the point, I think, is it's one thing to keep building outwards, and we've already done that, and now we're trying to deal with the consequences of that. But I will say those other places I think are useful, and it's helpful to understand that all of those places, well, I can't speak for Bellingham. The other three I know have a stronger economy than us right now, and so there's a lot more development pressure. And so I think it's also important to know, and Bend, Oregon has invested in things like trails and quality of life, and so it's also, I just want to add that bigger context that part of the reason why they're able to get this housing is these incentives, and because there's pressure to, you know, people are trying to move there. And they've done other things, including investing in things like their university. Missoula, Boise, and I think Bend all have universities. I don't know if Bellingham does. But so I think it is useful, but it's helpful just to look at the big picture. So I appreciate that you're bringing these examples.
thank you. Well, and I hopefully will. The idea of doing the case studies was to give us sort of a deeper look into just what you're talking about, which is, are there other things that are affecting it? Can we duplicate it in Anchorage? You know, what things that are being done can we duplicate? Because obviously we can't do everything. Like you said, we can't make all of the land available for free because we have a shortage supply of it. So we have to find another way to apply pressure. Next slide.
Mr. Shu?
Oh, sorry.
Just two questions. The first one to answer the second one is, so this is a slideshow summary of a report. Is the report published yet?
No, we're going to publish it at the housing.
At the housing, okay, great. And then, okay, so my second question then is, does the report include updated population projections for the bowl over the next 10, 20, 30 years? And the reason I'm asking that question is the baseline figure of housing production we've been living from for the past decade plus was built on population projections in 2010 that estimated we'd add 50,000 people to the Anchorage Bowl. I think we're not quite there yet.
I don't know that we're going to make that.
Yeah. So anyway, so they developed their housing demand models based on some population projections that I think have shifted quite a bit. So I'm just wondering if this report dives into that and we now have a new production number.
So we did not focus on a new production number. That's not, I mean, that's city planning. That's not, there's somebody smarter people than me have to do that. So what we focused on was the issue of attainable housing. Regardless of whether we focused on trying to solve that problem. So, you know, the housing projection, the population projections, and those kinds of things have to come from planning. That's not something I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris,
So you bring up such a good point. It might be obtuse to this presentation, but whether we're talking about transportation planning or land use planning, the 2035, I think it was, or the 2030 plan, which is where I kind of got started, had this, 45-degree projection of growth on the chart. And then at the 2010, we in the Fairview neighborhood said, look, we're never going to achieve that. you should fix that because it's irrational and it's being used by the transportation planners to set where we're investing our money in our roads, which then creates a vicious cycle. And so 10 years, 13 years later, it feels like we're probably still basing ourselves on the same projections, which is really problematic across the board when we have irrational numbers going in to establish where we're going to be building highways. That's how we get an additional lane on a federal highway for $200 million instead of doing the work inside of the areas where the people are actually living. So for our work, I think it's important to look at that. I know the planning department does their best. Long-range planners have a hard job because they have to see the future. But
It's all about crystal ball, it's hard.
it's an ongoing concern that we always project this massive growth curve that has not in 25 years proved to be real.
And for the purposes of the work that we did, we didn't do this work based on the projections. This work was to take a look at where we are and how we got there, and what can we do to get from where we are now, because whether we grow or shrink, that was kind of the point of that previous slide where we talked about the fact that our population is growing, yet housing prices are increasing. You know, normally when you have a market where people are leaving, it causes the housing prices to come down. It's not happening in Anchorage. Part of the reason for that is because of the lack of inventory. We had BP pull out of here years ago. How long was it? 5 years ago or 7 years ago? And it did nothing to soften our housing market. It only made it worse. So again, for the purposes of our work, we aren't projecting population. We're not looking at those things because, you know, those are, again, things for much smarter folks than us to do. What we looked at was, how do we create attainable housing? Is there a problem in attainable housing? Because home ownership is as Member Constant talked about a couple of meetings ago, that's the first way that most people build wealth, and that everyone deserves an opportunity to build wealth for their life. And so, next slide, please. So these are some of the things we'll talk about when we at the New Housing Summit. We have agreed, ACDA's agreed with Amanda asked us to help out with incentives, and so we're going to bring forth a ton of new ideas for you to take a look at that are in the report and not in the report. And these are just a few of them. And the next slide. So you can find, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about our current incentives, because if you go to acda.net, you'll find the current incentives explained. You'll find links to how to apply to them. You'll find information, for example, on the downtown and the Fairview and the opportunity zones. You'll find that information. It's readily available on our website. In fact, we're going to update it once we get the study done, and hopefully we'll get SB 77 passed in January, and that'll help us some. So you can find that stuff at acda.net. Get all the information you need. If you would, next slide. You'll see the maps. Next slide. And then there's my contact information. Anybody who has any questions or wants a copy of the report electronically when it comes out, let me know, because we're going to do, like I said, nice bound copies for everybody at the Housing Symposium. But thank you very much for an opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you, Mike. Any members have any?
So, I don't know all the details, but I met a young man last week who tried to develop some property in Anchorage. There's a gravel road into it, and he was telling me this horrific story of having to create a cul-de-sac, pave, put sidewalks, and I mean, he said, you bounce along on this gravel road, and then there's a paved cul-de-sac where his development is, and I feel like that's a huger issue in encouraging development.
Well, one of the
Very
things,
costly.
and I think that you are correct, but that's only one factor. So we can't blame everything on that. If we take a look, sometimes we like to point shoot and shoot at the easy targets. But I think what you'll find when you look at the report is it's not just planning. There's just not one thing. We have things we can do, I think, in all of those areas. When you look at finance, when you look at the way that we're planning, the way we're permitting, and there obviously no study like this would be complete without looking at our process that we go through as a municipality, from permitting and all of those things. But that's kind of what you're talking about. Is again, I don't know the nuances of the particular situation, but on the surface sounds silly, but is it silly? I don't know, right? I don't know. That's why one of the things that we've been working on, trying to put together a sort of consortium with planning, and we're working on infrastructure. We're trying to come up with some ideas for that because we know it's an issue. And we've been meeting over at ACDA to try to do that. And I think we're involving the state now with infrastructure, and they're trying to figure that out so that we can create some relief from an infrastructure standpoint. Kevin?
Another thing is just the cost of capital, and it's huge.
Yeah.
Okay, so for every 1% increase in interest rate, it relates directly to a 10% loss of buying power. In the last 2 years, we've seen interest rates go up 3%, from 4.5 to 7.5. That is a 30% loss of buying power for the same monthly mortgage payment.
Not to mention inflation.
And then inflation, going to add gas, insurance, all those external expenses. So, I mean, again, I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. One thing that we can look at is whether we focus on identifying special loan programs for residents and people who are working and operating within Anchorage, within the state, for the lower interest loans, because, I mean, just the cost of money is astronomical. Over 80% of our mortgages currently on residential housing are under 5.
Right.
That's why they don't sell. I have most sellers going, why would I ever downsize and do a larger mortgage payment?
Right. Yeah. Well, we had a much more robust year last year from a real estate sales perspective. That was one of the things I was surprised about. The number of homes that sold last year, it dipped some because of interest rates, but still it was over 4,000 transactions in Anchorage. And that sounds like a big number to me, right? It is a big number for.
And just to complete my thought here, we have multiple trust funds that have been established by other agencies, by other factions of our municipal and state government that have money that they invest, and they invest it out of the state, right? They buy bonds and utility bonds and infrastructure bonds in other areas around the United States in order to get an earning. Well, right now in mortgage-backed securities, you're looking at about a 7.5% rate. You're going to tell me that 5% isn't unacceptable, meanwhile investing in our local economy. So I think there's some opportunities also with some of the investment funds that we have, that if they were intentional and they focused on how do we help Alaska and how do we help here locally, rather than ship our investment dollars external outside to other areas, that we have the ability to enact pretty significant change.
Member Carr?
Yeah, thanks. A few things there. This idea of 4,000 units being a high number, high may or may not be good, right? So why are the reasons people are selling in an environment where if they sell and try to buy locally, their payment's going to go up for a smaller place, right? And so they aren't selling. There's a lock, and so the people who are selling for a reason like leaving Alaska.
Exactly.
And so that's actually not a net value to this conversation. If you think about it from an economics perspective, it's actually kind of a scary number. I don't have any basis for that, but reason dictates that there's a thing there that is maybe not so good. I wanted to actually speak though about what you brought up this morning about the developer, the young person, and the fact that they felt like it was a problem because they had to build their cul-de-sac out that they were developing, but the road leading in was junk. We have a phenomenon in our market where we lean on the developers and have forever to build our infrastructure out to the ends, and somebody has to pay for it. And so I have had conversations about this for a long time, and I want to support the developers in the housing markets. I'm also very skeptical about claims by developers that claim poverty when they're making millions. And so it's a very careful walk for us as policymakers to figure out what the right line is. And if a third party is going to be willing to come in and pay for infrastructure development, great. We just have to figure out how that's done and if it's equitable. Girdwood being the example, there's now money to extend water or sewer service out to Holden Hills because of a federal grant, so that won't be borne by the developer. All that said, I have had conversations with some of the most senior members of the home builders who won't say it in public, but will say it in private. This is our only investment in our city, and we should be investing in our city as developers because we're doing great. And so we have to balance the public message of we're poor, we can't make it work, with the reality that there are some problems with it. And so it's a very interesting conversation. And specifically in some areas like the first builder in, they pay for all of that. And then there's a time clock tick, 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 and I think it's 2 years, I'm not sure what the exact number is. before that time period, the second developer has to pay into the cost of that infrastructure. But after that date specific, then it's free for them. And so what you get is incentivization to not see further development in certain areas after someone came in. And so there are issues we need to resolve. It's a very interesting and complex set of circumstances.
We'll have a comment from Ms. Shitty.
I have a question on a different topic for Mr. Robbins, but if others want to continue this.
Well, I just wanted to highlight that we'll be talking a little bit about financing in our new business as part of the strategic subgroup that will come along, and we'll be having a discussion led by Amanda Moses today as well for the housing summit. So if there are questions around financing and other questions.
Mine's just about one of his slides. So
we have a question.
go ahead.
Well, yours is more pertinent if it's about a slide. I just wondered if there's the HUD home thing. I mean, my husband and I got a HUD home as we were trying to move into houses when we were young and poor. And it was $100 down. That program went along for a long time. Is that gone?
I can't tell you if that specific program is gone because I didn't come prepared to talk about it, but there are many HUD programs available, and there are new programs probably since you bought that one. Maybe it's not $100 down now. Somebody who sells real estate might know more.
It is not $100.
It might be, it might be a little different now, but it might be 1% instead of your normal 5%, or there might be some sort of, but I don't know. So.
If I may, NMLS number 2234920. License board. Most of those HUD programs are now just strictly listed, limited to HUD-owned properties, which means it's a bank-owned property. And so, I don't know when you bought it, what that cycle was. They may have extended it to non-HUD owned properties. But the difficulty is that our number of defaults right now is remarkably low. And so there's not a whole lot of REO activity out there. So,
all right, that's a financing question though. We were talking about finance, so I think that raising all financing types of questions is good because there's synergy to incentivization, but might want to keep the line on there. Comment from, or question from?
Yeah, thank you, for shooting. So the great slide that says results that matter, fantastic slide. And I assume you will talk more about your findings from those communities at the housing.
And they're dived into deeply in the report too. There's about, I think there's 8 to 10 pages dedicated to each of the markets.
Perfect. And so just when we see that, just so I am clear, these various results or ideas all resulted in market rate,
not market rate, attainable.
Or sorry, attainable.
Yeah, so attainable is just sort of, it's in market rate, it's in that category, but it's not what, like my house is market rated, what it's priced at right now, but it's not attainable.
Okay, thank you. That's important.
But yes is the answer to the question.
All right, thank you, Mr. Robbins, for the presentation. We look forward to the full report at the Housing Summit or Symposium. Very interesting, very important for us to hear. The next item for unfinished business is 3 and 4plex expansion continued. Council Gates is not with us today. And any commentary from?
Yeah, Hallie and myself to speak to this. We do have a draft AO and AM that's out amongst members right now, just making sure and tweaking some finer points. I think Dean comes back on the 22nd, so tomorrow. I know he's going to have a full plate, but there was just a couple small questions in there that had to do with a small multifamily that's referenced to R3A zoning types if it was necessary. So, but really close to having that ready to be introduced, and then set on the assembly agenda, get public hearing, and then revert back to planning and zoning. Go ahead, Allie.
So,
Identify yourself.
yes, my name is Allie Hartman. I work in Legislative Services and have been supporting the 3 and 4plex project. The ordinance is, I can't even believe that I'm saying this because it's just been such a journey to get here. The ordinance is, as Kevin said, super close to being publicly introduced. And it is the sponsor's intent to bring it onto the September 26th agenda through the addendum. And in that case, it will be made publicly available tomorrow. So
cut off, so we probably.
I think we lost it. I'm gonna read.
All right. Thank you. Where were you?
Yes. So
I have a question.
yeah.
Do you believe you'll be prepared today by 2 o'clock to get it on the agenda? Okay, that's, no.
Excellent.
The
She
maybe
nodded.
talking like shop a little bit. Dean is out through the end of the day. And so the intent is to submit it for the addendum today. And then if Dean, this is the latest draft from Dean, right? So if there are any further like legislative council edits, we'll submit an S version and
Yeah,
work through
or
the
amendment.
amendment.
The things that we're talking about are so minute, I don't think it has
Yeah.
any impact over the scope of what we're trying to do here.
And so
Presentation? You were gonna-
yes, the process for public input and participation will be that as the ordinance is introduced on Tuesday, the sponsors will refer it to planning and zoning and set a public hearing date in November so that planning and zoning has
I can speak to that now. I checked because someone proposed to me that they would like to have it at planning and zoning in the next 30 days. It doesn't work that way. And so I did check with planning and zoning, and I believe the first opportunity they would have to hear an item that was laid on the table like this would be the meeting in December. I'm not sure what day in December that is, but I'm guessing it's early in December. Yeah, so it's like the first Monday or Tuesday or something. And so, which would mean the public hearing, you want to try to set it for either the first or second meeting in December.
So, and I think the most important piece of this is however this process unfolds. The Title 21 ordinance is one half of the legislative package. There's another ordinance dealing with Title 23. And both of those will need to be brought before the Assembly for consideration and Assembly action ultimately, ideally in time for next year's building season, right? And so I think the specifics of those dates that will be set, we can work to finalize those. And I think that as with any public process, right, there will be some ebb and flow and potential for S versions or whatever else. So really excited at the end of the day that the Title 21 ordinance will become public here in the next few days, and that the public dialogue around implications of the Title 21 piece and the intent of the project as a whole will be able to be digested and talked through. And so with that, the sponsors will be giving a presentation at the next CEDC meeting on Thursday, October 5th. And walk through the intent of the project and all of the various elements that the Title 21 and Title 23 pieces are dealing with. So that'll be a really great opportunity for this committee to weigh in and talk through the work.
So I'll just put a pin that the Planning and Zoning Commission meets December 4th. The first Assembly meeting in December is December 6th. And the second one is December 9th. And so those are your critical deadlines. Or dates for public hearings.
And we'll look forward to that presentation here as well. And
Yeah, so we have a meeting on October 5th. We only have one. The 19th was canceled because it conflicted with something else.
we'll confirm that. So that we'll expect the presentation on October 5th, and we'll update this at the end of our meeting as well. But we'll just identify that there's a conflict on the second meeting of October, so we'll only have one meeting in October, which is going to be the 5th. Yeah, great, and that'll be the last meeting prior to the housing summit. Excellent. Are there any members of the public with us at this point? Any members of the public on the phone who wish to be heard? Don't hear anyone, so we'll move forward. The next item of new business, the Equity Center update, is postponed today as well. And so we'll have an update on that at the October 5th meeting as well. And there are some actions, and there's a project being taken on by Member Conklin and myself, so there are actions on that. The next item, it says housing discussion, but it really is about the subcommittee or the strategic committee that's associated with the Housing Action Summit that's coming up, where one of the pillars are funding, capital, and infrastructure. And so our committee, myself, and I've been working with Amanda Moser to give us some degree of a presentation today on some of the things we should be considering, helping us to get our minds around what actionable things we could be thinking about to bring into the Housing Summit, which dovetails really nicely with the incentive presentation around attainable housing, a wonderful term to really introduce into our community. And today we asked Amanda to come to help us have a brief discussion about what our expectations are, how we can inform the Housing Summit, and what things we could be thinking about as members in terms of projects and areas that we need to investigate, and how we can work with Amanda to bring those for a robust Housing Summit. Is that a good introduction, Lynn? And I'll turn it over to Amanda Moser at this point.
Thank you. Amanda Moser, and I'm excited to have this conversation with this group. I think I want to highlight back to Mike's presentation, the results that matter slide, I think really captures that to address this, you really need to pull a lot of different levers across the board in order to move this forward. And I think both at the spring retreat, we had over 80 individuals that joined us, both assembly members, subject matter experts, people in the building, developers, to have these conversations, and people really brought up stuff across the board that are creating challenges to housing. And I think I appreciate Mike's conversation about attainable housing. A lot of this conversation is just sort of housing full stop across the board, talking about affordable housing and attainable housing. And so we took all the data that we gathered at that housing retreat, and we recognized that it kind of fell into these various buckets. And one of the buckets was funding capital, and we recognized that a lot of that conversation also deals closely with infrastructure. Another one of the buckets is incentives, and Mike and his team are working with us on that one. We recognize that zoning is a bucket, and then reducing barriers is another bucket. I think one of the coolest things that's happening as we're beginning these conversations is that there's synergy across the separate categories, and there's really great opportunities for collaboration. And so a lot of the conversations that Mike is having with his incentives group might dovetail nicely with some of the conversations that are going to happen here or are already happening here, and there's really great opportunity for working together with the various groups. One of the reasons that this committee seemed like a perfect place to have this conversation is that so many of the conversations that you're already having are also part of the ideas that people brought forward at the housing retreat. And so there's really great opportunity to put some more energy behind some of those and move those forward. And so I love they're captured on the back of your agenda here, and specifically really talking about items C, D, G, H, I, J, K, M, N, and O, P. You almost the full alphabet. It's really great. But one of the other things that we recognized sort of after the retreat and leading into this work was so much of this stuff is also really consistent with what was laid out in the 2040 plan. And so the 2040 plan, released in 2017, recognized that we would need to create more housing. And as Shruti mentioned, some of the numbers were off about how much we needed to create. But regardless of that, like, we're really far behind of where we need to be, and you can feel that when we're looking for housing. And so one of the things that Assemblymember Martinez and I talked about was, to look at some of those, taking all the suggestions that people brought forward at the housing retreat and then running them through the 2040 plan. And based on the conversations that have been happening here in this group over the last couple months, is there's some other ideas that we can move forward. And so I'll sort of like go back and forth between Assemblymember Martinez and I. I thought one of the really interesting things that I keep hearing this committee talking about is the abandoned and vacant properties. And I am hearing this idea of a carrot and stick approach to them. And one strategy that I think could be really interesting to look at a little bit more closely is adaptive reuse ordinance that allows more of a carrot approach to taking those properties and exploring opportunities for redevelopment. And if you look at the 2040 plan, the second goal in the 2040 plan is infill and redevelopment to meet the housing and employment needs of residents and businesses. And I think Assemblymember Brawley brought this up perfectly earlier in the meeting. You know, we've built out, so now we really need to think about the strategies for infill where we already have infrastructure, and what something like exploring an adaptive reuse ordinance could really support infill development and also look at those abandoned and vacant properties. There's a really great example of LA did an adaptive reuse ordinance back in 1999. Love things that happened 2 decades ago, because then you can really understand the impacts of it. They really looked at their downtown area and wanting to bring new energy to that space, and so they brought in an adaptive reuse ordinance, and over the past 4 years, brought 20,000 new housing units into that space, and been successful, and they've expanded it, and they've actually gone out and renewed the adaptive reuse ordinance once in 2015, and they're looking at it again now. So I think that could be a really interesting conversation for this group. And I think it's also a great opportunity to talk about some of these other ideas, other thoughts that you had. I'll let you sort of share some of the other thoughts that we had talked about too, or if there was any of the big ones that
We're gonna walk through all of them.
you want me to.
Yeah. Anybody have, feel free to ping if they have any questions as you go along. Yeah, Karen?
Is it, so I just did a quick look at what adaptive reuse, it looks like
Do
most
people
of
have
it's.
this copy?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
There's a document that
Yeah.
is
I'll-
helpful.
Okay, it looked like it mostly is focused on downtown areas.
Let's see.
And I get a little heartburn when I see this chart that in Mike's presentation that shows that nobody wants to live on the east side. And perhaps that's because we need some adaptive rezoning, focusing on deteriorated properties on the east side. I don't want it to all be downtown when we're looking at making Anchorage desirable, because we have a vibrant east side, we just need help.
Yeah,
I
let's,
have a question there.
yeah, thank you. There's a question?
Yeah, for Mike. So it doesn't list East Anchorage here.
I
on the
didn't do that
table.
survey, that was AADC in 2019.
Right.
But if I may offer, sometimes when people answer survey questions, I'd like to live on a lake. So if you ask me where I want to live, so people say they want to live downtown, but it is also the most expensive land. It's the hardest place to build. There's a lot of these things about it. So I can't answer
Yeah.
any questions about it. I didn't do that survey.
I just think I wouldn't presume that East Anchorage doesn't have a number.
Correct.
I would just think that they just didn't add it, and so it'd be very great to refer back to that survey and find it.
I'll find it and add it.
Yeah, and I think the question about adaptive reuse, by definition, it's taking properties that had another function and then turning them into a different function.
Right.
The reuse being, generally speaking, from commercial to residential. And so it, generally speaking, is limited in the context to those kind of processes. And so it could be broadened in a number of ways. You know, it could be industrial to residential. And so in the conversation we're having broadly about deteriorated properties being converted or brought back to life, it doesn't really fall under the rubric of adaptive reuse. Maybe it could, deteriorated to useful. But I think your district and some of North Anchorage are going to be the most ripe areas for those reinvestments to happen, like what we appropriated 1.3 million for, those dollars are gonna probably hit our neighborhoods harder than anywhere, the 2.6 total. And so I think there's some real excitement here, but I would demand the numbers for East Anchorage because I think it's a presentation issue, not a fact issue.
Okay.
Member Braun?
Yeah, and just to point out too, examples of adaptive reuse that are not going in the right direction in this town for decades have been downtown, all the little houses that are now offices, and those are great, or parking lots, right? The buildings have been removed, and so just to say adaptive reuse can be a lot of different things, but yeah, I think it is fundamentally it's just another way to get more housing.
Yeah, and some of the stuff that they did in LA was they looked at some of the non-conforming issues and eliminated those to make it, to streamline the processes if you wanted to convert the use from what it was originally to something else. And that's something that it's always the dangerous to use the sort of like anecdotal, but that's like very much the conversation you have with the individual about building the road. I mean, that is a lot that I'll hear from folks of like, someone I was talking to that has rental, like a property that has 5 units for rent, and they wanted to go through and update all of the units, but because it's sort of been grandfather claused in, like if they did, they wouldn't be able to have like the 5 separate units anymore. And so there's a lot of interesting things like that that can kind of.
So it's a little more broad of a category than just the traditional kind of commercial. And I grew up in a industrial area that was totally converted on waterfronts in New York, and so now you couldn't even get to those places, but they became housing as well. For the sake of just our presentation today, we're working from a cheat sheet, basically, a document. So, and I wasn't clear that everyone didn't have one. We can make information available to you all. Yeah, so we'll post this. We'll introduce this today. And just for the sake of continuing on that, something that Amanda said that I'd like to highlight now is that the ideas from the Housing Summit with respect to these categories will run through the 2040 plan to see what changes could be made to create actionable steps toward actually hitting those goals. So this document are the 2040 land use goals with an overlay of actionable things that, like adaptive reuse as a strategy, right? And so it's really helpful to both understand that there are some good goals in the 2040 land use plan that we've heard. It's the why and the difficulties of achieving those goals. So when we heard from Mr. Robbins, just to put a framework on it, we're hearing the incentivization around attainable housing as it goes to housing number of overall goals. But this is a little different approach to some of the other nuanced areas that our committee can address and we can take legislative action. So on that front, I'd like us to just highlight the goals that we've outlined in this document so that you can hear them from the land use goals. So like this was goal number 2, which was infill and redevelopment meet the housing and employment needs of residents and businesses in Anchorage. And so one of the strategies that was under that rubric is adaptive reuse, for an example, right? And so there are different, you'll see more than one suggestion under most categories. Great work by Amanda thus far. But for now, let's just overall goal, and then maybe touch like an example of one of the categories so people can track what we're talking about and then have some sense of the projects that are potentially available for individual members to want to grab. Yeah, cool.
Okay. So I think goal number 2 is the exciting infill. Goal number 3 talks about centers and corridors. So mixed use, walkable commercial centers and corridors thrive within their neighborhood context, offering housing affordability to a range of incomes and enable business growth. And I think sort of coming back to the conversation about East Downtown, this is sort of like looking at areas that already have major thoroughfares and ways to connect to different businesses and services, and just ways to encourage and support those spaces. And once again, there's conversations about infill housing, goal 4-5, or action 4-5 of this. Oh, sorry. sorry, I read the wrong goal. So goal 4 is actually the one I'm going to talk about, which is Anchorage's neighborhoods provide a range of places to live, meeting the housing needs of residents of all income levels, household sizes, interests, ages, abilities, and races and ethnicities. So once again, just looking at providing opportunities for neighborhoods to continue to grow. And so there's conversations in this goal that came up at the housing retreat that kind of fit with the work this committee's doing around site and utility engineering design criteria for info housing, exploring amendments to standards and procedures. I know manufactured housing has come up both a lot at our housing retreat and throughout different conversations, and that is one of the actions laid out in goal 4. Pre-approved housing plans, which has come up in various conversations with the assembly and at the retreat, I think could be a really interesting conversation. Goal 5 is coordinated and targeted infrastructure investments that catalyze new growth and provide acceptable return on investment. This is a great opportunity for collaboration with the work that Mike Robbins and the Incentives Committee is doing, because there's a lot of synergy between those conversations and this specific goal. And so some of these actions that the 2040 plan puts forward is looking at the infrastructure costs that are borne by private developments and inhibit housing and work to explore infrastructure finance tools that address upfront infrastructure costs on private developers. That calls to take a comparison to a peer group, city's revenue source and fee mechanisms. And then goal 8 is Anchorage maintains, improves, and strategically expands parks, green belts, corridors, trail corridors to enhance land values. And the 2 actions under this that seem close to what the work this committee's been doing is pursue financial resources, including state and federal grants and bonding to fund feasibility findings, engineering, acquisitions, and restoration projects for creek corridors, high priority greenway supported development designations and wetlands. And then another conversation that I feel like came up at this one was establish a municipal wetlands bank and appoint a conservation easements. Am I correct about that? Ross, we were talking about.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm mildly distracted at the moment.
And then the last goal that had an action item that seemed close to what I had been hearing conversations at this committee.
So the Anchorage home builders had stated that a lot of the wetlands maps were outdated and that there was land that they suspected could actually be developed now just because development around it and the change of surface water and drainage. And you're probably aware it'd be good for us to go back and readdress that land that's near 100th and Victor or 100th in Minnesota over there, which there's, I don't know if it's hundreds of acres, guys, there's vast volumes of wetlands over there and undeveloped real estate. So you could go back and look at those, take a look at our water tables and see if any of that can be opened back up for development. I know specifically they're referring to the hillside where since then they've carved in roads and things have redistributed. And so land is currently tied up as a Class C wetlands. They believe could be developed, but because of the bureaucracy around developing on any wetlands now, they just don't touch it.
Yeah. And then goal 9 is a sufficient, predictable, and strategically located industrial land supply allows Anchorage's industrial and climate sectors to thrive, protected from non-industrial uses that might displace them. And goal action 9-10 is expand brownfield remediation assistance programs for industrial reuse by traded sector firms, apply for loans and grant incentives to expand brownfield remediation programs. And so I think one of the conversations that we had is 2040 plan sort of says, we took the 2020 plan, that was a vision, and now recognizing everything's changed, here are the action items to do. And it went through a robust public process. And so a good strategy could be to explore these different items that are in the 2040 plan and try and move some of those forward. And get opportunities for pulling the various different levers that are needed to like start making housing numbers shift.
In other way, these are direct steps toward taking down the elephant, bite by bite, with fidelity to the 2040 land use plan and actionable things that the Assembly could be thinking of now, essentially. Obviously, some of these things require other stakeholder alignment, but it's about how we walk away from the Housing Summit during our time now with really actionable projects, stuff that's in the works, other things to come alongside that we could be rolling out as basically, not necessarily in one omnibus, but chunks over time as we move toward next year. Member Brawley?
Yeah, and that's a good segue also just to remind folks, tomorrow we have a work session on a housing strategic plan. So it's not something that's written, but just to draw a line between Mr. Robbins' presentation, you know, we need a plan to get there. We need to align different stakeholders to that work. We need to pick some priorities, and then we need to tie it back to basically what we've been saying in our plans for 20 years, which is we need to redevelop existing areas. We need to address development challenges, all these other pieces. So just a preview, tomorrow we're going to continue that conversation.
No, that's a really good point.
And that's going to, just one more thing too, that's one of the products that I hope comes out of the summit is basically an almost finished draft of that plan as we work through it these next couple months.
Is that downtown? Where's the meeting at?
It's a work
Yes.
session downtown.
Down at the.
Yeah, it's on the public funds calendar.
Tomorrow. At what time is that?
I think it's at
1? It's in the, I know it's in the.
It's the first of our 2 work sessions.
Yeah, and it's just, that's a good point that there are many places where conversations around this big topic are happening. And the visioning is happening in some other areas, right? You know, but a lot of what our committees do are the ability to start to digest from vision to actionable things. And really, this committee has a unique role with respect to a lot of the departments that are fundamental to making tweaks and changes that are barrier reducers or incentivizers, essentially. Yes, Member Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure, probably Ross's department. I was speaking, I think, with Scott Campbell about a project that he's working on that's going to be really helpful, and I'm not sure the timeline, but we should be paying attention. He told me that they're planning to conduct a grid-by-grid citywide assessment of deteriorated properties. And so I suggested if they need support, they need to just ask. We'd be very interested in helping. I would like to get that in everybody's mind that we are going to, at some point in the not too distant future, have a true assessment of the condition of deterioration citywide.
Yeah, because there's no doubt, I mean, that stock of deteriorated property that we need to understand and get some data around is certainly part of why there's an inflated or an artificial inflation, considering that if there had been out-migration, the way Mr. Robbins described it before, there would have been a dip in housing at some point. But there seems to be some sort of other influences out there. And it really could be a factor of the underutilized housing stock that are in vacant and rental properties and deteriorated properties, adding value. So there's a lot to really consider in that area. And are any other questions from members? Any questions from members on the phone regarding this presentation? We will make this available to the public today. We'll make this available to members. It's a good guideline for our conversation at the summit, but if there are additional things that people see, please feel free to share them with us so we can add them to this list, and we can really create some projects that are going to be able to move the needle forward. Yes, Amanda.
Amanda Moser, once again, just so folks on the record. One other great thing about the Community and Economic Development Committee is the staff engagement. I think it's really important to make sure that we have the subject matter experts in the room as we're having some of these conversations. And so it's really great to have Planning here and Ross here, and I think that's an incredible part about this conversation.
Thank you. Any final questions? Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. We look forward to the summit and to everybody getting this and feeding and giving some feedback on it as well. I do want to make one note on a discussion that we've been carrying with respect to the dashboard, and so I wanted to thank Ross for working to advance the conversation with IT, with the innovation folks or IT people around how we can create better public-facing data for and dashboards. So I'm just appreciative that that conversation is continuing, and members should look forward to updates on that in the near future, hopefully. Thank you, Ross. I wanted to shout you out officially. Yeah. Any final items?
Just a couple here. We had mentioned that we're meeting twice a month. Mr. Constance had brought this up. We had originally gone to we had originally gone from once a month to twice a month earlier in this year, back when Pete Peterson was still on the assembly, because we were dealing with the parking minimums, ADUs, and we had a ton of items that were on the plate. One thing we might consider is going back to once a month meetings, being more of a regular schedule. But perhaps we could do that, and then after the housing summit, if we ended up, because after the housing summit, we typically have a large load that ends up falling on this committee. And maybe there's a better way that we can diversify this amongst other committees that are already in, just taking a look at whatever that is. But it might be a suggestion that we go back to once a month meetings, so I'm just letting that as an option. Thank you.
I would frame it slightly different. We will continue to consider the best options available to process the work in terms of both frequency of meetings. We've had the conversation of the venue of meetings. And so I think we've stayed with this venue at the time. We will always consider the frequency of meetings as well. And the note is that we have one meeting in October because AFN is during the time of what would be our second meeting. So we have one more meeting of this prior to the housing summit. So this was really the day to set up and queue us up for the housing summit with both presentations so that we have some degree of the bodies of work to come forward, and then we will continue to evaluate that moving forward. Cool. Sounds good. Thank you. If there are no additional comments from members, we are adjourned.
What do you want to check to see if there's anybody?
Oh, we did that. Audience.
We did our meeting again.
Are there any members of the audience with us who would seek to be heard? All right. Hearing none, we are adjourned at 10:10.